When institutions and cultures train people into passive compliance and conformity, they become playgrounds for manipulators, toxic people, and psychological parasites. In this video, I want to talk about how compliance culture enables manipulators. Compliance culture is the kind of thing that develops in societies where bureaucratic systems and mass institutions are dominant forces rather than supporting ones. It's where things like individual human agency, truth-seeking, truth-telling, connection to oneself get heavily disincentivized, if not punished, and replaced with compliance, people-pleasing, going along with the consensus handed down from above, because that's what is easier for these institutions and how they run, at least in the short term. It's where people are forced to become standardized and disconnected from themselves, rather than individuated and creating their lives a little bit more from the inside out. What I'm calling compliance culture is a lot of what I've spoken about on this channel, as it relates especially to the modern school system and the mental health system, and the authoritarian tendencies you find in those places. It's basically the kind of logic and dynamics underpinning both of those places. Whereas children, we're forced to break from ourselves and abandon a more true path for ourselves, where we are more reflexively pleasing and obedient, and just have to kind of accept the erasure of who we are. And as kids, the adults around us who are shaping us this way believe that what they're doing is an act of love. But it's not an act of love, it is an act of betrayal. But not consciously so. In fact, it's unconscious because they are products of that same conditioning. So it's really an intergenerational cycle, but one that remains quite taboo to talk about. And that's the key that I really want to emphasize here, that this institutional compliance culture operates on the level of conditioning. I repeat, conditioning, below the veil of conscious awareness. And that's what makes it so insidious. It's automatic. And that is also the level at which manipulators and predators are dealing with you. And that's why so many people are so vulnerable. Toxic people are leveraging that which is unconscious and automatic for you. And again, at the same time, these authoritarian bureaucracies and the cultures that surround them that can be, shaped sort of downstream of them, like families and peer groups, also operate on that same level. That is the core mechanism behind how these systems, like the school system, the mental health system, many corporate bureaucracies, and again, the different cultures and systems that surround them, operate and manage people. And that's why they create fertile ground for manipulators and toxic people, and why they cripple our civilization from dealing with it. And so, because these systems are heavily conditioning us from a young age, they are actively disempowering us. And I think it's important here to view toxic people as a relatively broad category. So what I've seen in most of the discourse today around like narcissistic abuse and sociopaths and things like that is it revolves around these really specific and perhaps relatively rare clinical labels like narcissism or sociopathy. And I think the problem here is actually much broader than that. I think these kind of like manipulative tendencies where people are basically leveraging other people's automatic and their conditioning to kind of feed off of them and sort of like fill their own emptiness inside of them, or however you want to look at that, like however that works for each person. I think that is like, those are tendencies that are much broader and much more common than just people that are, are diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder or whatever. And so I think recognizing that is important because it can help us, navigate what is in some ways and at sometimes a fairly perilous social landscape. Now, in terms of how this institutional compliance culture works in a little bit more of a specific grounded way, a lot of what it does is it conditions tremendous insecurity within us. And that insecurity is used to basically manage and control us within those systems. And it's not like an evil conspiracy, right? It's just kind of the mechanics for how these things work. So it's kind of like in the school system, right? We're all made to feel incredibly fearful and incredibly anxious around not being deemed good enough, around like being deemed stupid or inferior or whatever. And so it's like those kind of pressures that are used to shape and control us. It's just how the machine works. And so in all of these systems, we're left with fairly specific insecurities like, am I good enough? Am I going to survive? Am I going to fit in? Am I going to get in trouble? And so then what happens is these become like unconscious things that we basically orient our behavior and the very big decisions in our lives around to avoid feeling those things because they're so terrible. And so those are the hooks used by both these systems and toxic and predatory people. And so I guess the good life, if you will, is about looking directly at those things, right? It's about diverging from this culture in a pretty significant way. And it's about looking directly at all of those insecurities and things and integrating them and bringing a lot of compassion to them so that we don't have to just unconsciously create our lives from them. And we're not just kind of like in reaction to everything. And I think that as we do that, we become a lot more empowered and we can create lives that are a lot more powerful. And I think ultimately, like doing that work is how we create the kind of leaders that we need as a culture. And we don't have those leaders, I don't think, for the most part. Now, fortunately, it isn't always a smooth pipeline between these systems creating these obedient, compliant, pleasing units and everyone just getting exploited by the worst, like the worst people among us. Because there are people that resist this. And I think it's a significant portion of the population. There are people that sense that this is wrong, that sort of generate a lot of friction in those systems and those environments. And what happens to them? Well, as kids, it's really obvious to me now what happens to them. They get characterized as having behavior problems. They get labeled as mentally ill. They're said to have, all kinds of different like labels can be imposed on them, right? They can be said to have anxiety or ADHD or like all kinds of different things. But what's really going on is they're often, more sensitive. Maybe they have more kind of anti-authoritarian qualities. But I think at the end of the day, they value their own agency and they value their own kind of like internal compass or however you want to look at that. And so I think that like those are the people that are really kind of resisting that system. And that's why, fortunately, it isn't just as simple as these systems create these kinds of people and then everyone else, is destroyed by it. There is some kind of like humanistic friction that emerges. But again, unfortunately, the system makes these kinds of people the problem. Right. And so what's interesting to me is like often it's those people who have these really positive tendencies that are made to be the problem, but the actually really manipulative and predatory people often can actually function pretty well in those systems because they follow the spirit of those, or excuse me, they follow the letter of the rules, right? Like they're compliant within those systems according to kind of the letter of the rules, but not according to the spirit of them. And that actually works in these systems because the sort of HR type people running them don't really care about the truth. They just care about compliance, right? They don't have that much of a capacity to see or explore the truth because I think like people that have been so kind of incredibly shaped by that system and have just so seamlessly adopted institutional consciousness, They don't really have much of a center or much of a self from which to navigate any of these things. Now, I want to tell a story from my own life that I think illustrates this dynamic really well. So, this dynamic that I'm describing around institutional compliance culture and toxic people started to become really clear to me when I was in so-called mental health treatment as a teenager. So I was forced to go to so-called mental health treatment, not because I was mentally ill, but because I was one of these people that heavily resisted this kind of culture. I ultimately really saw through it, even though I didn't have like quite the language for it that I'm using now. I still kind of saw it and resisted it, and so that was a big part of the reason why I was, forced into these kind of like systems, like in the mental health system when I was a kid. And so, as a teenager, I was in one of these programs with quite a large number of other teenagers there, and so I was able to observe a lot, and ultimately was able to learn a lot because I could like see a relatively large number of things taking place. And I would say a vast majority of the people there were kind of in the broad category of normal, you could say. That's how I would think of it, right? We were all struggling with different things. Like, some people were there because they had been smoking a lot of pot. Some people were there because they were addicted to video games or were said to be addicted to video games. Some people were there because they were fighting a lot with their parents. Some people because they refused to go to school. Some people were just miserable. And some people had pretty negative tendencies in terms of like being harmful to others, but still I would say they were kind of broadly in the spectrum of normal. That was my perception of it. But there was a small, very, very small number of people. I would say like in my time there, maybe between 1 and 3 people I saw, just a couple of people that were in a different category. They were like they were in a category of people that was genuinely dangerous and genuinely scary, where like if you were listening to your gut, it was like, this is really fucked up. And this is somebody that you want to stay the fuck away from. These are not people with which you want to be stuck against your will at a so-called mental health treatment program. And then the program itself was run by a different category of person, which were these institutional authoritarian types, which I've been alluding to. The kind who do evil things, but not because they're psychopaths, but because they're just following orders and because they have good intentions. And, because they have so much love for the teenagers that they're working with, that kind of thing. And it's actually those kind of people that scare me far, far more than the sociopaths and the more like obvious predators. Because A, as I will describe here, they provide cover on some level for those more obvious predators. And B, because they don't really have much of a self. They don't really have much of a center, which is the nature of what happens when you just adopt this kind of institutional consciousness without any friction there. They are very incomplete people. They are the reason why these like ideologies can take over in society, spread like wildfire, and huge groups of people can be dehumanized and in some cases eliminated. I don't think that is a concern that's outdated at all. I think that that's something that we have to remain vigilant about, and I think that it's exactly this kind of person that is the biggest problem in that regard, as is really clear from reading history. Now, one of the things that became really clear to me was that these predators were manipulating the staff. And the reason, again, is because people like this do not have the skills and the achievements of the personality, and I would say like the psychological floor to properly manage those situations and properly deal with those kind of people. Effectively dealing with those people requires the kind of humanistic development that I've been talking about. The kind that is systematically eradicated by institutional compliance culture. Now, I want to be precise about this. It's not that these staff had zero awareness that these people were who they were, or that they couldn't identify them at all. They did have some awareness that these people were like a different breed of terrifying predator, but it's that they were almost entirely ineffectual at dealing with them. And they didn't understand that a healthy culture and a healthy society needs effective mechanisms for dealing with these people. And in particular, they didn't understand that a healthy culture needs to marginalize these people. You don't just like put them in the same kind of level, in the same category as everybody else. You don't draw false equivalence there. You need an effective way of marginalizing these people so that they don't destroy the people that they come in contact with, psychologically or physically. And as a culture, we are not good at dealing with that for the aforementioned reasons. Now, how do we become effective at dealing with these kind of people? What does that look like? Is there a recipe for that? Well, again, this is not just about the most extreme predators. This is about all manipulators, all people that have these kinds of tendencies where they sort of feed off of you and are kind of parasitic in these ways. Most of the information that I found around this, again, I find to be somewhat incomplete. Again, it's the kind of thing like in this sort of, the category of narcissistic abuse and dealing with sociopaths and that kind of things. It's mostly about like techniques for dealing with these kind of people and scripts and things like that, like gray rocking and boundary hacks and various scripts. And I think that kind of approach, while it may be useful at times, particularly for like kind of immediate management of an acute situation, I think is pretty exhausting and not very fun because it doesn't really increase your own power in the dynamic. It doesn't increase your own power psychologically and emotionally. And that, I think, is where the real answer lies. It's about building your own psychological floor that institutional compliance culture systematically dismantles. And so more specifically, what I think this looks like is it is about transcending all of that conditioning that I've been talking about, transcending that conditioning that is used to put these hooks into you so that you can be managed by these systems. And so that involves becoming really aware of all of our own insecurities and all of our own like unresolved shame and fear. And as you do that, you really do develop a lot more of this kind of very much embodied power that people can feel. And so you need a way and you need a practice of doing that continually. And it needs to be continual because I really think that project is never done. We may get to a place where we feel pretty good, but there's always more to be done. And it ultimately, I think, becomes pretty fun because you get to experience the benefits of that on an ongoing basis. And it just becomes like more like higher and higher peaks that you can climb in that regard. But I will say it is pretty hard to do this in a culture where you're not supported and where you don't have other people that get it and can support you in that, which is part of why I do things like this. It's why I create this channel. It's why I talk about these things on Twitter and elsewhere, because it does get a little bit easier when there are other people that understand and can help support it. And also, this is pretty hard to do when this kind of conditioning is sort of the basis for a lot of our relationships. And that's why a lot of people find that they have to either break from or just seriously adjust a lot of these relationships. A lot of people find they have to kind of break away from their existing romantic partners or their family of origin, or the different friends that they've had or different workplaces. And my view is it's not necessarily required to do that. That's not necessarily something that has to happen in order to transcend this conditioning. But it has been my experience that I've always had to be willing to do that. I've had to be perfectly willing to fully break away from those people and those situations and never interact with them again if doing so is going to compromise this kind of development. And then the final piece of this, which I find to be the most interesting and the most fun, is as we transcend a lot of that and we're no longer caught up in so many of these ways that we've been conditioned to turn against ourselves, we become a lot better at observing other people. And that is where a lot of the real power is. So we get better at observing other people, and we get better at listening to our intuition about them. Because I think like a lot of what so many of us are trained to do as young people is basically like not trust the immediate and strong signals we get about other people, because we're taught like, oh, well, you don't know them, like you don't know their backstory. But I think that our immediate signals about people are often like really accurate, and they really tell us a lot. And so like learning to trust those and kind of put words to them and not need permission from anybody, not need it to be kind of sanctioned or approved of by any clinician or any expert, and just learning to become our own experts about those things. That's where a lot of power is. And you can then use that powerful first person understanding of other people to navigate things in a way that is much better for your own enlightened self-interest. You can prioritize your own safety better. You can prioritize the safety of the group. You can help to kind of lead things in a more effective way. You can use that, and you can really powerfully influence things in a way that furthers whatever it is you value. And as you do that, I think that you really become much more of a hazard to these manipulative and toxic people. And I think that's a good thing. So these are my thoughts on how compliance culture enables manipulators. I hope this has been helpful for you. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Please also share this video with anybody who you think it might be helpful for, because my goal is really to just get these things out there to anybody who needs them the most. So I'd really appreciate your help in that regard. Thank you for watching this, and I look forward to having you for the next one.